Chapter 1. The Cancelled Garden Party. The morning sun had scarcely cleared the rooftops of St. Mary Mead when Miss Jane Marple, comfortably attired in her faded lilac cardigan and neatly pressed skirt, strolled along the gravel path leading to the village post office. Her basket was empty of mail, but her mind teemed with questions. Ever since the invitation dropped through her letter-box an elegant envelope bearing the crest of Weatherbury Hall, she had been pondering the curious circumstances of Lady Amelia Willoughby's cancelled garden fate. Invitations were rare, commodities in the genteel circle of villagers, and rarer still were cancellations once the date was set. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mr. Baker from behind his counter, handing her a small parcel. "Something for the drawing-room, I expect?" "Indeed, Mr. Baker, a china sugar bowl from my niece," she replied, tucking it gently into her hand and offering him a warm smile. "And how are Mrs. Baker and the children today?" "As well as can be," he answered, though his eyes darkened. "But I dare say you've heard at least half the story of Lady Amelia's misfortune." Miss Marple nodded, her keen gray eyes alight with interest. "Only that she fell ill," she said dryly. "Yet the mention of illness seldom deters Lady Amelia from her social engagements." Mr. Baker shrugged. Ill or ill-advised, that garden party was to be the event of the season, and now cancelled. He leaned in conspiratorially. "Some say it was influenza. Others whisper of something more alarming." Miss Marple thanked him and departed, her mind already racing. Influenza in July was suspicious, certainly, but more suspicious still was Lady Amelia's long history of impeccable health. She turned toward Cherry Tree Cottage, planning to send a quick note of inquiry to the vicar's wife. Mrs. Peters was Lady Amelia's most trusted confidant, and her letter might shed some light on the matter. By the time Miss Marple returned home, the air was already thick with anticipation of the fate that would not be. The village green, normally a picture of summer gaiety, stood deserted. Bunting hung limp, and the promised marquee lay folded on the lawn like a toppled tent. Near the iron gates of Weatherbury Hall, Lady Amelia's butler, Mr. Griffiths, paced in measured steps, his black tailcoat immaculate despite the chaos around him. Miss Marple approached with polite curiosity. "Good afternoon, Mr. Griffiths," she greeted him. "I trust Lady Amelia is on the mend?" The butler inclined his head. "She is resting, madam, but she is grateful for your kind concern." His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed slight tremors as he adjusted his white gloves. "I fear, however, that Lady Amelia's illness may serve only as an overture to a far more delicate situation." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You surprise me." "Illness is illness. Events follow as they will." She paused, studying the tight lines around his mouth. "Would you care to tell me more?" He hesitated, then seemed to decide it would be better to speak. "Very well, madam. There are complications. The hall has been closed to visitors, friends, and family alike since early this morning. Lady Amelia has insisted on absolute privacy, which is most unlike her." Miss Marple frowned. "Privacy is an odd companion to a public fete." "Precisely," said Mr. Griffiths. "Furthermore, her guests have been turned away at the gate, without exception. She will see no one but her physician and closest family." He lowered his voice. "It is rumored that someone was taken ill at dinner last evening, a Mr. Edmund Fallow, a business associate from London. He was stricken suddenly and transported to the local infirmary where he remains in a grave condition. A chill crept along Miss Marple's spine. Edmund Fallow was relatively unknown in St. Mary Mead, but the narrow circle of local gossip had already dissected his brief visit. He was an acquaintance of Lady Amelia's late husband, and his presence here, so soon after her bereavement 2 years past, was viewed by some as an unwelcome reminder of old sorrows. "Do you think the two events are connected?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mr. Griffiths stared at her, the faintest quiver in his collarbone. "Lady Amelia fears so. She believes that last night's meal may have been compromised." "Compromised?" Miss Marple echoed. "You mean poisoned?" Mr. Griffiths averted his eyes. "I dare not speak further, madam, but Lady Amelia requested that I entrust you with her deepest gratitude for your friendship and, if you are inclined, your discretion and assistance." Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "You may give her my best wishes and tell her I shall come to the hall this evening with tea and sympathy, if she will allow it." The butler relaxed fractionally. "Thank you, madam. Lady Amelia awaits your visit." As she made her way home, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled. A cancelled garden party, a sudden illness in a stranger, a reclusive hostess, everything pointed to hidden tensions at Weatherbury Hall. She recalled the letter she had found upon her doormat that morning, a simple white card inscribed, "In." Lady Amelia's flowing script, "Regretfully, the garden party is cancelled. Sincerest apologies, A." No hint of explanation, no suggestion of scandal, only a polite regret. Her mind drifted to her friends in the village. There was Mrs. McGillicuddy, whose exuberant gossip often concealed a shrewd perception. There was Colonel Melchett, returning from service and ever eager to chime in with his views on propriety and politics. And, of course, there was Dorothy, the vicar's daughter, whose quiet intelligence Miss Marple had long admired. By 4 o'clock, the village teemed with whispered rumors. In the tea shop, Mrs. Stringer dabbed at her hanky. "They say young Master Willoughby discovered something in the flower beds, some strange vial half buried, like a poison fit for murder." "Poison?" replied Mrs. Redfern, shaking her head. "Is it not more likely to be some folly of youth and experiment with concoctions?" But Mr. Fallow was struck ill after partaking of Lady Amelia's famous elderflower cordial, Mrs. Stringer insisted. It was served at dinner in the west drawing-room. Miss Marple sipped her own tea, listening with calm attention. Outside the window, a silver pheasant strutted across the lawn, oblivious to human affairs. She glanced at her watch. 5 o'clock, plenty of time to don a modest hat and shawl, then walk the short mile to Weatherbury Hall. Her boots crunched on the path as she approached the wrought iron gates. Inside, the sun-dappled drive curved past ancient oaks and beds of lily until it reached the broad front steps. There Mr. Griffiths awaited her, and beside him stood Lady Amelia herself. The lady's complexion was paper white, her golden hair swept back in its usual meticulous style. She wore a silk dressing-gown of pale green, the color reminiscent of early spring. "Jane," said Lady Amelia, her voice quiet but steady, "I am so glad you have come." Miss Marple offered her hand. "I would not miss it for the world," she replied, "and pray forgive my intrusion." "Not at all," Lady Amelia assured her. "I sent for you because I fear we are dealing with something quite serious. Mr. Fallow's condition remains precarious, and I am not myself certain what to make of it all." Miss Marple led her carefully to a settee in the shadowed hall. A silver teapot and cream jug were already laid out on a low table beneath a portrait of Lady Amelia in her youth. The sight of the portrait, a vigorous, laughing countenance, seemed to deepen the hush that fell between them. With the clink of porcelain, Miss Marple poured the tea. "Let us speak plainly, Amelia," she said. "Tell me everything you know about the cordial, about your guest, and about anything unusual you may have noticed before illness struck." Lady Amelia clasped her hands around her cup. "There was no sign of ill intent, Jane. Only the usual merriment, laughter, music, the scent of roses. But afterwards, in the servants' hall, I noticed that Emma, my housemaid, looked pale and shaken. She told me she had found a small glass vial among the vases, a clear liquid like water, with no label." Miss Marple nodded, her mind assembling the pieces. "And this vial, did you see who handled it?" Lady Amelia shook her head. "No. Emma found it late, after the guests had departed, and she was too frightened to approach me directly. She left it in the study, and I sent her home. I should have attended to it myself, but I was taken ill almost immediately." Afterwards, Miss Marple set her teacup down gently. "We must recover that vial, and the cordial bottle. Every vessel should be examined. Poisoners are precise in their work. They leave behind traces unnoticed by the untrained eye." She paused, watching the pale face beside her. "Tell me, Amelia, do you suspect any of your guests? Anyone with cause to harm Mr. Fallow or to punish you?" Lady Amelia's lips trembled. "Who can say? He was a third cousin, once removed, and yet, Jane, I feel the bitterness of old disputes. Father's debts, legal troubles. Mr. Fallow profited from the sale of our family estate, and though he denies all blame, his fortune was built on our downfall." Miss Marple rose, brisk as a spring breeze. "Then we have motive. Let us not delay. We shall discover the truth, Amelia, step by step, clue by clue. And by tomorrow morning your garden party may yet bloom, though in a different form." Outside, the lily gleamed in the waning afternoon light. Somewhere among their petals lay the answer to a mystery as yet unsolved, and Miss Marple, in her quiet wisdom, was already piecing together the labyrinth of secrets that would lead her, inevitably, to the heart of the crime. Chapter 2. Whispers. Among the roses, the following morning, a pale haze clung to the dew-soaked lawns of Weatherbury Hall, as Miss Marple arrived just after 7 o'clock. The hush of dawn was broken only by the distant caw of rooks circling the ancient oak at the far boundary. Wrapped in her soft wool shawl, she climbed the broad stone steps and paused in the vestibule to greet Mr. Griffiths, who stood waiting with his usual composed demeanor, though his eyes revealed a weariness born of too little sleep. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said quietly, bowing ever so slightly. "Lady Amelia is in the library. She will see you there presently. Shall I take your cloak?" Miss Marple smiled. "Thank you, but I am quite comfortable." She smoothed the folds of her skirt, then followed him through a corridor lined with ancestral portraits. She noted, as always, the muted clank of servants preparing breakfast behind closed doors, and the faint aroma of coffee and toast wafting through the air. The library was cool and shadowed, its tall windows overlooking the rose garden where early blooming petals glistened with moisture. Lady Amelia sat at a writing desk, the small glass vial balanced on a silver tray beside a pristine white teacup. Emma, the housemaid, hovered discreetly in the background, her face pale but determined. "Jane, thank you for coming so early," Lady Amelia began, pushing aside a sheaf of letterhead papers. "I trust you slept well?" "I slept like a log," Miss Marple replied, approaching the desk. "Nothing like a good night's rest to sharpen the senses." She gestured to Emma. "And how are you this morning, Emma?" The girl curtsied, her hands twisting the skirt of her uniform. "Better, thank you, ma'am. I am quite determined to help in whatever way I can." "Very good," said Miss Marple kindly. "Tell me, Emma, about the night of the garden party before. Mr. Fallow fell ill. You discovered a vial in the study. Where exactly did you find it, and what did it look like?" Emma swallowed and lowered her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I was sent to fetch one of the silver candlesticks from Lady Amelia's study after the guests had departed. The study door was open, and in the corner, behind the small mahogany writing table, I saw something gleam among the petals of a rose. Bouquet. I bent down and found the vial half buried in the flowers." Miss Marple leaned forward, examining the silver tray. The vial was slender, about 3 inches long, with a tiny cork stopper still intact. Inside was a clear liquid that caught the morning light. She picked it up by the narrow neck. "This is the same vial, I presume?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma confirmed. "I left it here. I was frightened." "Quite right," Miss Marple said. She set the vial down gently and turned to Lady Amelia. "May I examine the cordial bottle as well?" Lady Amelia nodded and pressed a handbell. Within moments, the footman appeared, carrying a crystal decanter bearing the remains of yesterday's elderflower cordial. The decanter bore no label, but the familiar scent drifted from its neck. A few dark stains clung to its base. Miss Marple poured a small quantity of cordial into a demi-tasse spoon and held it up to the light. "Look here, a slight oily film around the rim, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. Poisoners often use such oils as carriers for their chosen toxins." Emma gasped softly. Miss Marple continued, "We must send these immediately to Dr. Mortimer at the infirmary for analysis. Meanwhile, I wish to retrace your steps, Emma. Show me precisely where you stood when you discovered the vial." Emma led the way through the library, past shelves of leather-bound tomes, and through a side door into the study. The room was small but cozy, with a writing table facing a window overlooking the rose garden. A burgundy carpet muffled footsteps, and a scattering of petals lay across the desk as if no one had disturbed them since the previous evening. Miss Marple stepped carefully round the table, noting faint impressions in the carpet, 3 distinct. Footprints, 2 smaller, 1 larger. She pressed her gloved finger to one and then tilted her head. Footwear with a slight heel and a scuffed edge. Perhaps a woman's guest who wore a slipper or low shoe. She looked up at Emma. "Tell me, did you see anyone lingering here after dinner?" Emma considered. "I thought I saw Mrs. Lancaster, the vicar's wife, leave the library and head this way, but I waved and she returned to the gathering. She did not enter the study." "Mrs. Lancaster is a devoted friend of Lady Amelia's," Miss Marple mused aloud. "She would have little to gain and everything to lose. But footprints can deceive, especially when petals hide the full outline." Back in the library, Miss Marple poured the remainder of the cordial and the liquid from the vial into separate glass jars she produced from her handbag. These must be kept apart. The decanter's cork must be resealed carefully. Any contamination could spoil the analysis. Mr. Griffiths, summoned again, received the jars with trembling hands. "I shall deliver them to Dr. Mortimer without delay." Miss Marple nodded. Then she turned to Lady Amelia. "Now, tell me about Mr. Fallow's arrival. Did he partake of anything unusual before dinner? A special cordial, perhaps, or a private cup of tea?" Lady Amelia sighed. "No, and yes. I invited Mr. Fallow to join me for tea in the conservatory after the party proper. It was to be a private consultation about family papers. I served tea from the silver urn and offered a slice of lemon sponge. He accepted gratefully, but he did not touch the elderflower cordial until dinner." Miss Marple scribbled notes on a small pad. "Interesting. So he had 2 beverages that evening. The tea in the conservatory, followed by the cordial in the drawing-room. Yet he fell ill only after the dinner course." Emma's expression darkened. "He looked flushed after tea, ma'am, but I thought it was the heat from the conservatory. It was quite warm inside, with the morning sun still shining through. A warm room can hasten absorption, especially of potent substances," Miss Marple observed. "And one must consider the possibility that the poison was applied not to the cordial itself, but to the cup or saucer he used earlier." Lady Amelia shivered. "You mean someone spiked his teacup?" "It is a theory," said Miss Marple. "We shall need to examine those cups and saucers. But first I propose we speak with the other house staff and perhaps some of the guests. I would like to pay a visit to Mrs. McGillicuddy and Colonel Melchett at the vicarage. They were both present last night and may recall details overlooked by others." Lady Amelia rose, smoothing her dressing gown. "Very well, Jane, I shall make the necessary arrangements." Miss Marple paused at the window, looking out at the rose garden, where the pale blooms drooped under droplets of dew. "Poisoners are like spiders," she said softly. "They spin their webs in plain sight. We must tread carefully, lest we become entangled in rumors and false leads." Lady Amelia followed her gaze. "I trust in your wisdom. Pray let me know what I can do to assist." "Just keep this house open to me," Miss Marple replied, "and send for me at once should anything else arise. Tomorrow evening we shall gather again here in this very room, and by then we will have much more to discuss." As she left the study and made her way back through the silent halls, Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of anticipation. A game of shadows and whispers had been set in motion, and every footstep, every reluctant confession, would bring her closer to the truth. The garden party might yet bloom, if only the petals of deception could be peeled away to reveal the crime at its heart. Chapter 3. Seeds of Suspicion. Miss Marple's footsteps were almost inaudible on the polished oak floors as she left Weatherbury Hall and set out on the short walk to the vicarage. The morning air was crisp, and the hedgerows lining the lane were alive with blackbirds and thrushes, their song oddly at odds with the grim business that occupied her thoughts. She tugged her shawl more snugly around her shoulders, recalling Emma's timid account of the hidden vial in the rose petals and the oily sheen on the cordial decanter. How many opportunities had the poisoner been afforded? And who among Lady Amelia's guests had the motive, the nerve, and the opportunity? At the vicarage gate, Mrs. McGillicuddy awaited her with a flourish of scarves and smiles. The older lady's eyes sparkled beneath her silver coiffure, and she waved a gloved hand. "Good morning, my dear. I heard you were on the case, so to speak, and I couldn't resist coming to offer my condolences on the cancelled fete." Miss Marple returned the smile. "Thank you, Mrs. McGillicuddy. May I come in?" Of course, of course." Mrs. McGillicuddy bustled ahead, leading her into a cozy drawing-room where Colonel Melchett sat reclining in an armchair reading the morning paper with keen interest. He looked up and extended a veteran's salute. "Ah, Miss Marple." "Colonel." Melchett here was just remarking on the prospect of a summer without Lady Amelia's splendid hospitality. The colonel folded his paper and regarded Miss Marple dryly. "Indeed, one suspects there's more to this than a mere bout of indigestion." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am inclined to agree. Lady Amelia fears she was the target of something far more sinister, a deliberate poisoning." At the colonel's raised eyebrows, she added gently, "Her guest, Mr. Edmund Fallow, remains gravely ill at the infirmary, and a small glass vial was discovered among the rose petals in the study. Emma found it, and Miss Marple examined it last night." Mrs. McGillicuddy gasped melodramatically. "Good heavens! Among the roses! Why, how very Gothic!" "Gothic, yes, but quite real," Miss Marple said. "I have brought samples of the vial's contents and the elderflower cordial to Dr. Mortimer for analysis. In the meantime, I wanted to speak with both of you, as you were present at the dinner party and may recall details that escaped others." The colonel leaned forward. "I was seated at the head table, adjacent to Lady Amelia, and almost directly opposite Mr. Fallow. He seemed in good spirits, perhaps too good, as he drank 2 glasses of the cordial. I recall noticing, however, that he lingered even after the rest of us moved into the music-room for coffee and liqueurs." Miss Marple's eyes lit. "You saw him linger?" "Indeed. I rose to stretch my legs and saw Mr. Fallow standing alone by the decanter. He appeared to be staring intently at the crystal stopper, as if considering whether to refill his glass." "And did he?" Miss Marple pressed. "He did, but only briefly." Colonel Melchett shrugged. "He poured himself another half-glass, sipped it, and then replaced the stopper before joining the others. He paused. Curious, wasn't it? He seemed rather anxious, more so than the average gentleman sampling cordial." Miss Marple made a note. "Anxiety can be a symptom of guilt or of knowledge. How well do you know Mr. Fallow?" "Only in passing," the colonel replied. "He's a solicitor of some repute. Had dealings with Lady Amelia's late husband's estate. That business left many feeling aggrieved, including certain distant relatives." "Distant relatives," Miss Marple echoed, tapping her pen against her notebook. "Do you recall any among the guests who might have harbored resentment? Perhaps someone who benefited from the estate sale?" Colonel Melchett frowned. "Well, there was Miss Henrietta Gwynne, Lady Amelia's goddaughter. She received a modest legacy, nothing compared to Mr. Fallow's windfall, but enough to raise eyebrows. She seemed uneasy last night, kept to herself, and I heard her muttering about injustice." Mrs. McGillicuddy sniffed. "Poor dear girl, Henrietta has always been sensitive, but she's the sort to cry rather than plot a crime." "Emotions can run deep," Miss Marple observed. "What of Lady Amelia's own relations? Any family present?" "There was Lady Amelia's cousin, Sir Rupert Chalmers," the colonel said. He arrived late after dinner had begun and withdrew almost immediately to the smoking room. He hesitated. I thought it odd that he avoided both the music and the coffee. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Avoided coffee? That is noteworthy. She looked at Mrs. McGillicuddy. Did you see him after dinner? Mrs. McGillicuddy pursed her lips. I did, briefly. He passed me in the corridor, returning from the study. I asked after Lady Amelia, and he said rather curtly that he would check on her later. He did not appear ill, nor did he linger at the decanter. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. She jotted down a few lines, then closed her notebook. Thank you both. Your observations help paint a clearer picture. She stood. May I impose on you for one more favor? I would like you to recall any servants who handled the decanter or the silver utensils at dinner. Poison can be applied at any point glass, spoon, even the lacquer on a teacup. Mrs. McGillicuddy chuckled. I think Emma did mention that the footman, James, polished the silver just before dinner. He takes great pride in his work. Aha, said Miss Marple. And Emma, she saw him polish the silver? Indeed, Mrs. McGillicuddy replied. In fact, she was sent to the pantry for more sugar, and the decanter was left in the sideboard alcove. She glanced in and saw James dusting it with a cloth. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And James had no one assisting him? No one else in the pantry? Mrs. McGillicuddy hesitated. There was Mrs. Hayes, the cook, but she was occupied in the kitchen. James was alone with the silver. Colonel Melchett stood. Then we have another potential opportunity. Any of the staff with access to the pantry or decanter could have introduced poison. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Precisely. We must consider every one guest and servant alike. But first, let us arrange to question James and Mrs. Hayes. If the poison was applied to the decanter or a cup, their testimony may reveal something overlooked. Mrs. McGillicuddy rose with theatrical flair. I shall accompany you. I have such a talent for conversation, and perhaps I can put James at ease. The colonel laughed. Very well. Miss Marple, you have yourself a small team. Miss Marple bowed. I am grateful. Come, then, to Weatherbury Hall. There is much to be uncovered, and little time to lose, especially if Lady Amelia's reputation is at stake. By 9 o'clock they were back at the hall. The household buzzed restrained anxiety. Mrs. Hayes hovered over her silver service, casting anxious glances at the covered table where the decanter stood. James, the footman, stood rigidly by. His face pale. Miss Marple entered the pantry with Mrs. McGillicuddy and the colonel. The room was lined with gleaming copper pans and white enamel cookware. A single window let in cool morning light, illuminating the polished handles of trays and utensils. James, Miss Marple began gently, we are gathering information about last night's dinner service. You polished the silver and arranged the decanter in the sideboard. Did you not? James swallowed. Yes, ma'am. I always polish the silver myself before the ladies and gentlemen arrive. And you were alone? Miss Marple asked. He nodded. I was alone until Emma brought the sugar, but I don't think she noticed anything unusual. Mrs. McGillicuddy interjected. Tell us, James, did anyone enter the pantry after you had finished? Any stranger or guest? James shook his head firmly. No, ma'am. After I polished the decanter, I left it here under the cloth until dinner. No one touched it until Emma fetched it for Lady Amelia's after-dinner coffee. Miss Marple looked at the covered decanter across the room. Emma said she saw a pale film on the decanter rim. Did you notice that when you polished it? James frowned. No, ma'am. If there was any residue, it must have been applied after I set it down. Colonel. Melchett folded his arms. An opportunist, then someone who followed you into the pantry or waited until the sideboard was unguarded. Miss Marple tapped her chin. Or someone who handled it during or after dinner, perhaps a guest with a decanter in hand. She turned to Mrs. Hayes, who had entered quietly. Mrs. Hayes, would you mind telling me whether any items from the pantry were used elsewhere last night? Cups, saucers, spoons? The cook's eyes widened. Everything was brought through here, ma'am, plates, cups, even the tea urn before the conservatory. But I admit I did not watch every hand that reached for them. Mrs. McGillicuddy patted Mrs. Hayes sympathetically on the arm. We understand that accidents happen, dear. But did you notice any guest who asked for something special, perhaps a particular cup or spoon? Mrs. Hayes shook her head. No, ma'am. Everyone was polite, but businesslike. Mr. Fallow did ask for the lemon sponge, but that was in the conservatory. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the stack of teacups by the sink. We must examine each piece, wash away any lingering traces, and inspect for fingerprints or blemishes. Will you fetch the entire service? Mrs. Hayes hurried away. James watched her go, then exhaled shakily. Miss Marple placed a calming hand on his arm. You've done nothing wrong, James. Your testimony is most helpful. He managed a tentative smile. Thank you, ma'am. I only wish to serve Lady Amelia faithfully. Miss Marple nodded. We all do. Now let us unearth the truth, so that justice may prevail and this house can be restored to peace. As the pantry door closed behind Mrs. Hayes, Miss Marple stood at the center of the room, surveying its gleaming surfaces. Each polished spoon, each carved handle was a potential clue. Somewhere among these innocuous objects lay the seed of suspicion, and with it, the path to unmasking a POISONER. Chapter 4. Shadows in the conservatory late afternoon. Light filtered through the tall windows of Weatherbury Hall's conservatory, gilding every leaf and petal with a honeyed glow. Miss Marple stepped into the fragrant chamber, the scent of jasmine and citrus blossoms mingling with the faint, lingering aroma of tea. The air was still, as though the room itself held its breath in expectation of her arrival. She paused at the threshold to take in the scene, silver urn on its stand, delicate porcelain cups arrayed upon a lace-covered table, and a half-eaten lemon sponge neatly arranged on a gilt-rimmed plate. It was here, 2 evenings ago, that Lady Amelia had invited Mr. Edmund Fallow for a private consultation, and perhaps here that the first hint of something amiss had been delivered. "Thank you for seeing me, Emma," Miss Marple said, greeting the housemaid, who stood near a row of potted orchids. Emma's pale face brightened at the sight of her friend. "I hope you're feeling better." "Much better, ma'am," Emma replied, smoothing her apron. I remembered something on my way here. I didn't mention it before, because I thought it was only my imagination. Imagination can sometimes be the first alert to danger, Miss Marple observed kindly. "What did you notice?" Emma glanced toward the tea table, as though afraid of being overheard. "The doorknob, ma'am. It was damp, and there were faint smudges like someone gripped it in a hurry." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Good. Show me. They approached the brass handle of the conservatory door. In the slanting light, the knob gleamed unevenly, its patina disrupted by dark streaks. Miss Marple bent to examine the glass pane beside it and traced a narrow smear with her gloved fingertip. This could be residue from a hand oil or wax from a glove, perhaps, but it may also carry a fingerprint. We shall need to take an impression. Emma's eyes widened. I can fetch a print kit, ma'am, if you like. That would be most helpful. Miss Marple rose, nodding to the housemaid. In the meantime, let me reconnoiter the rest of this room. She walked among the ferns and palms, noting the way the afternoon sun danced across the tiled floor. Each plant pot stood on a small dish, and near the vestibule door she saw two. Footprints pressed into the dust, one larger, one smaller, like the echo of hurried passage. She knelt to inspect them, then stood and moved on, pausing by the tea-table. The silver urn was still warm, though it had been hours since tea was served. A thin ring of liquid marked the linen beneath it. Miss Marple lifted the urn's lid and inhaled. No strange odor, only the familiar scent of black tea. She inspected the spout and found nothing amiss. But then she reached for one of the cups and examined its lip, discovering a faint streak of discoloration, almost imperceptible against the white porcelain. She tapped it lightly. Craig will know what to do with this, she murmured to herself. Stepping back, she surveyed the scene. From a distance, the sugar tongs glinted at an odd angle, and a teaspoon lay half-hidden beneath the lace-cloth. Miss Marple lifted the spoon and examined the bowl under the bright glass. No obvious tarnish or residue, but the handle bore a tiny nick, as though it had scraped against a hard surface. She slipped it into a clean paper envelope she had brought. In her handbag dot as she worked, footsteps sounded behind her. She turned to see Colonel Melchett and Mrs. McGillicuddy entering through the main house door. "Ah, Jane," said the colonel, inclining his head. "Word reached me that you were here." Mrs. McGillicuddy flashed a conspiratorial grin. "Colonel and I have been discussing potential suspects, and we thought you might appreciate our insights." She clutched her handbag. "I've brought some pamphlets on palmistry, just in case." Miss Marple smiled indulgently. "Thank you, Elizabeth, but I fear we must stick to tangible clues." She gestured around the conservatory. "We suspect that if Mr. Fallow was poisoned here, it may have occurred earlier than dinner, perhaps even before he returned to the drawing-room for cordial." The colonel frowned. "But he seemed healthy when he left here. I waited to bid him good night, and he smiled and nodded. I would have noticed if he felt unwell." "Poisoners can choose fast-acting compounds," Miss Marple said. "He may have felt nothing until he had resumed the warmth of the drawing-room." She paused. "Have either of you noticed anything unusual since?" Mrs. McGillicuddy planted her handbag on a fern stand. "Well, the orchids, they seem to be leaning slightly away from the doorway, almost as if recoiling." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Plants, too, can react to toxins in the air, though I doubt that is more than poetic coincidence." "Colonel." Melchett moved to the French windows overlooking the rose garden. "I confess I haven't ventured out there since the party. It all seems rather forlorn now." Miss Marple joined him, gazing at the drooping blossoms. "The garden may yet hold clues." She pointed to the path where Emma had discovered the vial. "We must retrieve that vial for analysis and perhaps search the border for footprints or disturbances. Emma reappeared, carrying a small box of implements. Miss Marple opened it and withdrew fingerprint powder, lifting a small brush with care. She powdered the doorknob with a light touch, then pressed a piece of cellophane tape against the surface and lifted it, sticking the tape to a backing card. "There," she said. "We'll have those prints analyzed alongside any we find in the study." Colonel Melchett peered over her shoulder. "Clever, clever. But what of motive? So far we have several suspects, Miss Gwyn, Sir Rupert, even some of the staff." Miss Marple closed the box and stood. "Motive may guide us, but opportunity is key. Look about you. This room opened both to the house and the garden. Someone could have slipped in unseen, laid their trap, and departed unnoticed." She turned to Emma. "Was there any sign of forced entry?" Emma shook her head. "No, ma'am. Both doors were open for ventilation, and the windows were latched, though one was slightly ajar. A small window left open is an invitation," said Miss Marple. "We must measure the latch to see if it's had recent wear. Also, I would like to ask Lady Amelia whether anyone else requested a private audience. A second invitation could provide the window of opportunity." Mrs. McGillicuddy clicked her tongue. She did mention that Mr. Fallow was not the only guest she wished to consult. "She spoke of her cousin Rupert. Didn't you say he retired to the smoking room?" Miss Marple nodded. "He did, but perhaps he came here later. We must verify his movements. In the meantime, let us leave this table intact. I would like to photograph it as is." She tapped her handbag and retrieved a small camera. "Mrs. McGillicuddy, would you mind standing back?" The older lady complied with theatrical solemnity. Miss Marple snapped several shots of the urn, the cups, the spoon, and the scuff mark on the handle. "Perfect." Stepping back, she slid the camera into her bag. "Thank you. Now, let us collect the evidence." She picked up the envelope containing the spoon and the teacup wrapped in tissue from Emma. "Be careful with that." Then she turned to the Colonel. "You and I shall walk the garden path and inspect for footprints or broken branches. Emma, you may accompany Mrs. McGillicuddy to the study to confirm that the vial remains untouched since yesterday." The four of them divided into pairs. Miss Marple and Colonel Melchett stepped into the late afternoon sun, the warmth a counterpoint to the chill in their thoughts. They moved toward the study window, following the gravel path where the ground still held impressions from 2 days. Earlier, Miss Marple paused. "Here, look at the soil. Those are boot prints, deeper than the others. Someone heavier or leaning with force." The Colonel knelt and inspected the prints, lugged through the garden, then into the room. Yet no one reported hearing footsteps. "Silence is a poisoner's ally," Miss Marple said. "These prints lead from the conservatory door to the study threshold. We must compare them with shoes of those present, especially anyone with new or muddy footwear." They spent the next half hour tracing the prints, noting variations in depth and stride. Meanwhile, inside the house, Emma and Mrs. McGillicuddy examined the study's hidden corners. Emma opened a small cabinet and found the vial exactly where she had left it, its contents settled at the bottom and a meniscus of clear liquid. Mrs. McGillicuddy peered at the narrow neck. "I wonder if we might need a magnifying glass." "A simple task," Emma replied. "I'll send up Miss Marple's magnifier." By the time they reconvened, Miss Marple had collected a handful of soil samples in waxed paper. She accepted the vial and spoon from Emma and placed them all securely in her bag. "Excellent work, both of you. We now have prints, soil, residue from 2 implements, and the vial itself." She counted on her fingers. 4 pieces of evidence, more than enough to set our inquiry in motion. Colonel Melchett cleared his throat. "What next?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Now we wait for analysis. Dr. Mortimer will examine the liquids, and the fingerprints will be lifted at the constable's station. In the meantime, we must question Sir Rupert and Miss Gwen about their night-time wanderings." She slipped her bag over her shoulder. "But first we shall call on Lady Amelia for tea in the drawing-room. She deserves an update." As they walked back through the garden toward the golden glow of the conservatory, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a new lead. Clues, like petals on a rose of Sharon, opened one by one, and at their heart lay the secret that would reveal the poisoner. The garden party had been cancelled, but in its place a subtler gathering was under way, a meeting of minds, each mind sharpened by the promise of discovery and justice. Chapter 5. Echoes in the smoking room. Miss Marple returned to Weatherbury Hall's grand drawing-room just as the grandfather clock chimed 5. The late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the heavy damask curtains and the gilt-framed portrait of Lady Amelia's late husband gazing serenely over the scene. Lady Amelia sat upright on a chaise longue, her dressing-gown exchanged for a sober morning frock, and she offered Miss Marple a polite, if somewhat anxious, smile. "Jane, I am grateful for your efforts today," she began. "Have you learned anything of use?" Miss Marple settled into an armchair opposite her hostess, laying her leather satchel on the rug. "We have gathered several pieces of evidence: fingerprints from the conservatory door, soil samples from the garden path, a residue from the teaspoon and cordial decanter, and the vial itself. All await examination by Dr. Mortimer and the constable. In the interim, I propose we question a few of last night's guests, beginning with Sir Rupert Chalmers in the smoking-room." Lady Amelia's brow furrowed. "Sir Rupert has been most reticent. He claimed he preferred solitude and the company of his cigar." "Solitude can invite temptation," Miss Marple observed, "especially when no one else is present." She reached into her satchel and withdrew a small notebook. "I shall speak with him directly." She rose and smoothed her skirt. Outside the drawing-room, Mr. Griffiths appeared at the doorway. "If you please, madam, Sir Rupert awaits in the smoking-room." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you." She followed the butler down the corridor, pausing to note the closed door of the smoking-room and the faint curl of tobacco scent. With a quiet knock and the butler's cue, she entered. The smoking-room was dim, lit by a single shaded lamp, its fringed edge casting soft halos on the tapestry walls. Sir Rupert Chalmers sat behind a small ebony table, the stub of a cigar smoldering in an ashtray. He looked up, his expression polite but guarded. "Sir Rupert," Miss Marple began, "I hope I am not disturbing you." He waved a hand dismissively. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Please sit." He patted the chair opposite him. "It appears I am under scrutiny." Scrutiny. "You understood that I should like to speak with you," she said gently. "It concerns last night's events and the unfortunate illness of Mr. Fallow." His jaw tightened. "Yes, most regrettable." but I assure you I left the dinner and retired here almost at once. I did not re-enter the drawing-room, nor did I taste any cordial." "I understand you did not touch the cordial," Miss Marple said, "but you did speak privately with Lady Amelia earlier in the conservatory, did you not?" Sir Rupert nodded. "We discussed family papers, old letters, and account books." He exhaled a plume of blue-gray smoke. "Our family history is a tangled web. I was to advise her on phrasing a legal addendum." "An important matter," Miss Marple acknowledged. "And you took tea from the silver urn?" He hesitated, then replied, "I did, but the tea was exquisite, and I experienced no ill effects." "Miss—" Marple folded her hands. "The poison may have been fast-acting, Sir Rupert. My concern is less what you drank than what you might have handled. You passed through the conservatory doors, and then, if I am correct, you entered the pantry en route to this room." He frowned. "I did pass by the pantry, but it was closed. I stopped only to admire the silverwork, or so I thought." "Emma saw you pause there," Miss Marple said. "She noted your interest in the silver decanter, which lay covered on the sideboard. She also remarked upon the way you handled the door knob on your way in here. There were smudges, later lifted for fingerprint analysis." Sir Rupert's eyes flickered. "Fingerprint analysis? Really?" "Really," Miss Marple affirmed. "It is best that we know who touched what to narrow our list." She offered a reassuring smile. "I do not accuse you, Sir Rupert, merely seek the truth." He inclined his head slowly. "I understand. You have my cooperation. My hands are unsoiled, though I confess I seldom wear gloves indoors." He held out a palm for inspection. "If you wish, you may dust for prints here." Miss Marple rose and dusted the table's corner with her finger, finding no fresh residue. "Thank you. Now, you mentioned that after tea you proceeded directly here. Did you cross the garden path at any point, perhaps to view the roses?" "Sir?" Rupert considered, only briefly. "I stepped out to inhale the evening air and admire the bloom. I bent to examine a particularly fine specimen pearl of England, if memory serves." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "And did you notice anything upon your return? Unusual footprints, perhaps, or disturbance among the petals?" He shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary." The dew settled glistening on the petals. The path was quiet. He stubbled out his cigar and stood. "I trust that answers your questions." Miss Marple rose as well. "It does. Thank you for your candor, Sir Rupert. I shall be in further touch if needed." He bowed slightly. "Of course, Miss Marple. I await the outcome of your inquiries." With that he opened the door and left her in the still, lamplit air of the smoking-room dot. As she retraced her steps to the drawing-room, Miss Marple's mind whirled with impressions. Sir Rupert's uneasy craftsmanship of words, his hesitation over footprints, and his keen interest in the silver, but no decisive proof. Back in the drawing-room she found Lady Amelia awaiting her, and Mrs. McGillicuddy perched on the edge of an ottoman, fanning herself with a folded letter. "Jane, have you spoken with Sir Rupert?" Lady Amelia asked. "I have," Miss Marple replied, taking her seat again. "He admits touching the decanter in the pantry and passing through the conservatory, but denies any knowledge of the vial." She glanced at Mrs. McGillicuddy. "And you, Elizabeth?" Mrs. McGillicuddy waved the letter theatrically. "I have been corresponding with Miss Henrietta Gwynne. She writes that she retired early to the smoking room as well, feeling ill a headache, nothing serious, and that she saw Sir Rupert there with a cigar. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Henrietta felt unwell before the others? Yes. Mrs. McGillicuddy continued. She thought it odd, so she went up to her room. She did not join the after-dinner coffee. Miss Marple leaned back. So Henrietta may have fallen ill before Mr. Fallow and before the cordial was served. Lady? Amelia paled. Can that be? My cordial was served at dinner, but Henrietta left before the coffee and liqueurs. Exactly, Miss Marple said, which suggests that Henrietta's illness stemmed from something earlier, perhaps the tea in the conservatory. Emma entered, with a small tray bearing fresh tea and biscuits. Miss Marple accepted a cup. Thank you, Emma. She sniffed the steam. No sign of poison here, I think. Emma set the tray aside and lingered. Miss Marple, may I ask, did you find any trace of powder on the tea saucer? Miss Marple frowned. I did notice a faint residue on one saucer, so slight I would not have caught it without close inspection. I secured that saucer for the constable. She took a gentle sip, bitter but innocuous. Emma drew a breath. I remember Mrs. Lancaster took that very saucer for her second cup. She looked surprised when it tasted odd. Mrs. McGillicuddy clapped her hands. Ah, the vicar's wife. She would be ill-equipped to mask a bitter taste. Miss Marple set down her cup. We must speak with Mrs. Lancaster immediately. A poisoned saucer, a hidden vial in the rose petals, and 2 guests ill at different times, these cannot be mere coincidence. She stood, laying a reassuring hand on Lady Amelia's arm. We are closer than ever to the truth. Outside, a distant roll of thunder echoed, as if Weatherbury Hall itself sighed at the turn events had taken. Inside, Miss Marple's calm resolve shone brighter than any storm-lit sky. The poisoner's web was unraveling, and with each interview, each scrap of evidence, the pattern took shape. Soon, she knew, justice would bloom once more, and the case of the cancelled garden party would reach its quiet, determinate end. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Revelation Morning. Mist still clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple set out from Weatherbury, hauled toward the little curacy beside the churchyard. The events of the previous evening swirled in her mind. The discovery of the poisoned vial, the strange illnesses of both Mr. Fallow and Miss Gwyn, and the lingering question of who had possessed the motive, means, and opportunity to harm them. Now, she hoped, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Eleanor Lancaster, might open a door to deeper understanding. Mrs. Lancaster awaited her on the porch, neatly dressed in her Sunday best, despite it being only Wednesday. Her pale blue gown and white gloves bespoke propriety, but her eyes, under dark brows, held a tremor of unexpected concern. She greeted Miss Marple with a gentle curtsy. "Good morning, Jane. I hope I am not discomfiting you at this hour." "Not at all, Eleanor," replied Miss Marple, returning the curtsy. "Your presence here held significance last night. May I come in?" The vicar's wife led her into a snug front room, its shelves lined with theological tomes and well-thumbed. Prayer books. A slender brass clock ticked softly on the mantel, and a vase of fresh lily perfumed the air. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Lancaster said, offering Miss Marple a cup of weak tea. "I know you have much to attend. I find our pursuit of truth both necessary and absorbing." Miss Marple smiled settling into an armchair. "You mentioned a peculiar taste on a saucer you used after dinner. I wonder if you could tell me more." Mrs. Lancaster's hands trembled as she set the cup down. "Yes, it was that second cup after the coffee and liqueurs. I asked Emma for more tea, and she brought me a delicate cup on a saucer. I sipped carefully and found it bitter, acrid not at all like Lady Amelia's usual brew." Miss Marple tapped her notebook. "You did not taste anything unusual in the first cup?" "No, the first cup, served within the conservatory, was fine. It was the second cup, taken in the drawing-room, that seemed tainted." "And you noted whose saucer you used?" Mrs. Lancaster nodded. "Emma placed it before me without comment. I didn't think to inquire which set it belonged to, but when the taste struck me, I glanced down and saw that the saucer bore Lady Amelia's crest in a tiny gilded motif." Miss Marple pressed her fingertips together. "Thank you, Eleanor. Your recollection is invaluable. And you did not subsequently handle the teacup, did you?" "I touched only the handle," Mrs. Lancaster replied, and handed the cup back to Emma, who removed it at once. "Excellent." Miss Marple made a note. "Now, Eleanor, you witnessed Miss Gwynne's illness. Did she show any sign of suffering from the same bitterness?" "Miss Gwynne was seized with a headache after her tea," Mrs. Lancaster said thoughtfully. "She told me she felt faint and excused herself abruptly. I offered mine, but she declined, unable to face more. The headaches were her first symptom?" "Yes. She said only that her head throbbed fiercely, and that she must retire. I escorted her to the hall, and she hurried up the stairs." Miss Marple nodded. "We must compare her symptoms with those of Mr. Fallow, who fell ill after cordial, and yours with dinner guests who remained unaffected." Mrs. Lancaster sighed. "I fear I have been careless, but I did not think to observe every detail." She looked contrite. "Your testimony is far from careless," Miss Marple assured her. "It is precise and illuminating. May I ask one more favor? Could you reconstruct for me the sequence of events at the after-dinner service, especially when Emma brought your tea and when you stood or moved about?" Mrs. Lancaster closed her eyes and nodded. "I remember that after coffee we all rose, and Colonel Melchett offered to show us Lady Amelia's new watercolor of the garden. We moved through the corridor toward Thelibury. It was there that I asked Emma for more tea. Then I lingered near the portrait of the late Lord Willoughby, transfixed by his sombre countenance, I suppose, before stepping away to join the others." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Do you recall if anyone else remained behind, perhaps 2 figures whispering?" Mrs. Lancaster hesitated. "Yes, Lady Amelia and Sir Rupert were speaking in low tones by the French windows. I thought Sir Rupert looked troubled, and Lady Amelia gently touched his arm before he walked away." Miss Marple's pen skated across the page. "Their exchange could be significant. Perhaps a disagreement tension could breed rash action." She closed her notebook. "Thank you, Eleanor. Your recollections will guide our next steps." They rose together, and Miss Marple smoothed her shawl. "Before I go, do tell Emma not to discard that saucer or cup. It must be preserved for analysis. And if you could quietly ask any other guests if they experienced odd tastes or sensations, that would be most helpful." Mrs. Lancaster inclined her head. "Of course, I shall do so discreetly." Miss Marple thanked her and departed, feeling that the net was tightening. The pattern of exposure became clearer. Tea in the conservatory, had been benign, but the second tea in the drawing-room bore promise of poison. Both Miss Gwynne and Mrs. Lancaster fell foul of it. Mr. Fallow, blinded by cordial, was hit later, yet Colonel Melchett, Sir Rupert, and others remained unaffected. Why, on her way back to the hall, she paused by the ancient yew in the churchyard, and considered the soil samples she carried in her satchel. The faint scent of damp earth mixed with crushed petals recalled the vial buried in Lady Amelia's roses. The same poison, she suspected, had been administered 3 times, in the conservatory cup, in the drawing-room saucer, and in the cordial. Someone had prepared the poison carefully, then introduced it into these vessels at different points in the evening. The question was, who had moved among these spaces with such freedom, and why without approaching the hall's imposing front door? Miss Marple caught sight of Emma, standing anxiously on the gravel drive. The housemaid curtsied as Miss Marple arrived. "Ma'am, Dr. Mortimer is here," Emma said, pointing toward a broad-shouldered figure crossing the lawn in a crisp white coat. "He requested the samples," Miss Marple smiled. "Excellent. We shall see what science reveals." She patted Emma's shoulder. "And thank you for all your help. You have been courageous." She followed Emma into the hall, greeting Mr. Griffiths with a brief nod before making her way to the library. There Dr. Mortimer arranged the small glass jars and vials on a side table. He glanced up and smiled at Miss Marple. "Good morning. Miss Marple, I see you've brought quite the collection." "I trust your labors to unravel them," she said. "Can you share any preliminary findings?" Dr. Mortimer coughed politely into a handkerchief. "The cordial sample contains traces of atropine enough to induce convulsions and collapse within minutes. The vial's contents match exactly. The tea residue, however, shows only a mild stimulant, possibly caffeine, but no toxin." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. So the conservatory tea was safe and intentional diversion, perhaps? "Indeed," the doctor agreed. "The drawing-room saucer, though, bears minute deposits of the same atropine, and the teaspoon exhibits a film, consistent with oil-based poison carriers." Her lips curved. "Thank you, Doctor. Your work has been most enlightening." She turned to Emma. "You and I must speak with Emma again, and with James and Mrs. Hayes, so they understand what the tests reveal." Dr. Mortimer packed his instruments. "I'll leave you to it. Call if you need anything further." As he departed, Miss Marple traced the pattern. 3 exposures. 2 victims with mild symptoms, 1 plunged into crisis, and a single culprit behind them all. She crossed to a chair and sat, folding her hands. The puzzle lay in identifying who enjoyed both the proximity and the opportunity to lace the tea saucer, the teaspoon and the cordial decanter over the course of one evening. Moments later, Lady Amelia entered, her composure restored by the doctor's presence, though her eyes still held concern. "Jane, any news?" Miss Marple rose. "Yes, Amelia. We have confirmation of atropine in the cordial and on the drawing-room saucer and teaspoon. The conservatory tea remains pure. Whoever carried out these deeds met Mr. Fallow to fall last. But trifling with the saucer was part of a larger plan." Lady Amelia's face tightened. Who could do this?" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "We shall find out. Keep the guests nearby this afternoon, and I will question them again, especially those who move between the garden, the conservatory, and the drawing-room." Lady Amelia nodded, steeling herself with determination. "I will do as you ask." Miss Marple smiled. "Very good. The poisoner's web tightens. Soon we shall draw it closed around them." Outside the shadows lengthened, but within Weatherbury Hall light dawned on the machinations of a cunning criminal, and within that light Miss Marple would shine until the darkest secret was laid bare. Chapter 7. Interrogations in the West. When the drawing-room had been transformed into a makeshift interview chamber by mid-morning, Lady Amelia, longing for the bright gaiety her garden party once promised, watched anxiously as Miss Marple arranged chairs in a semicircle. The sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long patterns on the carpet, but the air felt heavy, with tension rather than warmth. 4 guests, Miss Henrietta Gwynne, Colonel Melchett, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Lancaster, and Sir Rupert Chalmers, sat facing the detective, each appearing tenterhooks of nerves. Emma stood discreetly by the sideboard, ready to replenish tea, while Mr. Griffiths hovered outside the door, a silent sentinel. Miss Marple tapped her notebook. "Thank you all for assembling on such short notice. I know this must be unsettling, but I assure you the aim is to ensure we uncover the truth quickly and discreetly. First, I should like to revisit the sequence of events in the drawing-room last evening. Mrs. Lancaster, would you remind us of when you first felt the bitterness in your second cup of tea?" Mrs. Lancaster nodded, smoothing her gloves. "Certainly. We had returned from the music-room, and Emma brought more tea, placing a porcelain cup on a gilded saucer before me. I held the cup by its handle and sipped. Almost immediately I grimaced. It was acrid, not at all like the Earl Grey I expected. I handed it back to Emma and excused myself. Miss Marple made a note. "And you touched only the handle?" "Only the handle," Mrs. Lancaster confirmed. "Thank you. Sir Rupert, you passed through the conservatory after tea. Did you notice Mrs. Lancaster complain of bitterness?" Sir Rupert leaned back, taking another puff from an unlit cigar. "No, I was already on my way here when I heard a slight gasp. I glanced back through the French doors and saw Eleanor handing her cup away. I paused for a moment, wondered if she was unwell, then continued on." Miss Marple nodded and turned to Colonel Melchett. "You escorted Miss Gwynne upstairs when she felt ill?" The colonel cleared his throat. "Yes." Henrietta looked pale and said her head throbbed. I offered my arm and took her gently to the hall. She insisted she could go no further, so I left her there and returned to the drawing-room to inform Lady Amelia. Miss Marple looked across at Miss Gwynne, whose eyes remained lowered. "Miss Gwynne, did you notice any unusual taste in your tea, or any other sensation before your headache?" Henrietta's voice was soft. "I did taste something odd, something clinging to the rim of the cup. It was faint, but I detected a metallic tang. I thought it was my imagination until the pain began." "Thank you," Miss Marple said. "And you touched the same saucer as Mrs. Lancaster?" Henrietta hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it bore the same gilded crest. Emma had arranged a single service for after-dinner tea, but I cannot say if my cup was exactly the same." Miss Marple made another note. "Emma, perhaps you could clarify. Did Miss Gwynne and Mrs. Lancaster use cups from one set or from separate services?" Emma stepped forward, her voice steady. "They both used cups from the drawing-room blue and gold service. I know because the finer china white with a rose and gold motif was reserved for Lady Amelia's private cup. I brought the blue and gold. For general service. Miss Marple turned to Sir Rupert. And you did not take tea from this set? Sir Rupert shook his head. I took coffee here, and earlier tea in the conservatory set, which was plain white porcelain. The plain set was safe, Miss Marple murmured. The drawings point us to the blue and gold service in the drawing-room. Now, Sir Rupert, you mentioned you paused when Mrs. Lancaster reacted. What did you do next? I left as soon as I saw she was unwell, he said. I felt it improper to linger. And you did not return to the drawing-room? Miss Marple asked. Not until later, when I joined Lady Amelia in the library to discuss our business, Sir Rupert replied. Miss Marple looked at her notes, then addressed the Colonel. Colonel, after escorting Miss Gwen upstairs, did you witness anyone else handling tea or the silver service? Colonel Melchett closed his eyes in concentration. I recall seeing James the footman retrieve sugar from the pantry. Then Lady Amelia's butler, Mr. Griffiths, carry the decanter in for cordial, but I did not watch each movement. My focus was on Henrietta's welfare. Miss Marple nodded. And Mrs. McGillicuddy? I notice she is not present. Lady Amelia explained. Elizabeth was called away to the vicarage. Mrs. Lancaster's daughter fell ill with a fever. She will return shortly. Miss Marple allowed a moment's pause before speaking again. We have identified that the poison, atropine, was administered in 3 places, in the blue and gold saucer for Mrs. Lancaster, and Miss Gwen on the teaspoon used for cordial in the drawing-room, and in the elderflower cordial itself. That suggests a deliberate progression. Test the method, then strike decisively. Everyone shifted uneasily. Miss Marple continued, We know that the silver teaspoon and decanter were polished and handled in the pantry by James, and that Emma saw Sir Rupert examine the decanter there. We also know that someone needed access to the glasses and cups in the drawing-room. Now, let us consider opportunity. Who among us moved between these areas unobserved? She glanced at Sir Rupert. You admit to 2 visits through the conservatory and pantry. Mrs. Lancaster, you moved from the music-room through the drawing-room to the hall. Miss Gwen, you too passed through to leave. Colonel, you escorted her. That leaves Lady Amelia, the household staff, and thought it would pain me to say so, the late Mr. Fallow's host. Lady Amelia took a steadying breath. I admit, I moved about, but never touched the silver or the blue and gold set. Her voice was firm. Miss Marple nodded. Your movements are accounted for by your illness and by tending to your guests. Now, Emma, when did you first notice the oily residue on the cordial decanter? Emma replied, after Sir Rupert's visit to the pantry before dinner. I fetched the decanter into the drawing-room and saw an oily film around the rim. I thought it odd, but assumed it was residue from oiling the rack. Miss Marple's pen paused. James, did you oil the rack or apply any lubricant to the decanter? James, waiting outside the circle to be summoned, was called in. His face was white. No, ma'am. I polish with cloth and chamois leather, no oils. Miss Marple's eyes met his. No oils. Then someone else must have applied a substance. Who had the means? Who could have done so without drawing attention? Sir Rupert's mouth twitched. I did inspect the decanter, but I touched only the stopper once. Miss Marple smiled kindly. That would leave a fingerprint if so. The prints on the pantry doorknob were compared. James did not match them, nor did Emma or Mr. Griffiths. Your prints, Sir Rupert, did match those on the knob. Sir Rupert stiffened. I admit to handling the knob and the decanter, but did not apply anything. Miss Marple leaned forward. Were you alone when you did so? He hesitated. I thought I was. I came to discuss the addendum with Lady Amelia, but I paused to admire the silver, as any guest might. Miss Marple closed her notebook. Very well. We shall need to inspect your glove for traces of atropine. But there is one more question. The blue and gold service cups, saucers, teaspoon was washed and returned after dinner. Who handled? The washing? Mrs. Hayes, summoned along with James, stepped forward. Her eyes flicked nervously among the seated guests. I washed the cups and saucers in the kitchen sink, then set them aside on the drying rack before returning the cordial. Decanter to the pantry? Miss Marple turned to James. And you moved the decanter from pantry to drawing-room? James nodded. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Griffiths directed me. Lady Amelia looked astonished. But I always bring it in myself. Mr. Griffiths, summoned by Miss Marple, bowed. Lady Amelia requested that I relieve her of the task while she attended to Mr. Fallow's condition. I asked James to bring it in. Miss Marple folded her hands. Thus the chain of custody is clear. Mrs. Hayes washed the blue and gold. Service. James carried the decanter. Between these two tasks, the poison could have been applied to the pouring surface of the silver, then into the tea saucers or teaspoon. It would require access to the kitchen or pantry during or after the wash. She looked across the circle. Who had a plausible reason to be in the kitchen or pantry? Sir Rupert passed through. So did I and Lady Amelia, but she was unwell. Emma brought sugar, but did not wash. Mrs. Hayes washed items. Mr. Griffiths seldom entered the pantry. Colonel and Henrietta only passed through the hall. Mrs. Lancaster never entered the kitchen. A silence fell. Miss Marple rose. I believe our suspect is among those with both motive and frequent access. Mrs. Hayes, the cook. Gasps of surprise. Arose. Mrs. Hayes's face went ashen. Me, ma'am? Why, how could you think? Miss Marple held up a hand. Hear me out. You washed the blue and gold service and set the items aside alone, in the kitchen. You then have the opportunity to handle the cups, saucers, and teaspoon before they return to the drawing-room. You carried them unobserved by others. Mrs. Hayes's hands shook. I had no reason. I served Lady Amelia faithfully. Miss Marple nodded. Perhaps, but I also understand that cook's work in a large house can breed resentment, particularly if one feels underappreciated. And you knew of Mr. Fallow's role in the family estate, did you not? You may have learned of grievances among the Willoughbys' dependents. Tears sprang to Mrs. Hayes's eyes. My husband lost his job when the estate was sold. We came here for a fresh start. I was so grateful, and I loved the way Lady Amelia treated me as part of the household. Mrs. Hayes closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were red. But sometimes I could feel everyone's eyes on me suspecting. And then, when the sugar wouldn't dissolve in the tea, I thought perhaps she had tested a new sweetener on me, until I saw Miss Lancaster's face contort. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And so you decided to act, to take revenge on behalf of your husband. Mrs. Hayes let out a shuddering gasp. No, I didn't mean him harm. I only meant to scare Mr. Fallow, to show him what it felt like. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Revenge often outgrows its beginnings. You spiked the saucer for Mrs. Lancaster and Miss Gwyn accidentally. They were in the same set. You thought the conservatory tea safe, then tested your mixture in the cordial, believing only Mr. Fallow would taste it. Tears rolled down Mrs. Hayes's cheeks. She sank to a chair. I didn't know. Miss Marple stood, folding her hands. The law will decide your fate, but your confession spares further inquiries. You may rest now. The truth has been spoken. Silence enveloped the room, pierced only by the distant chime of the hall clock. Outside, the garden awaited its healing, but inside, the echoes of a cancelled party were at last stilled by the quiet wisdom of Miss Marple's gentle justice. 8. Restoring the garden's grace with Mrs. Hayes escorted to the guest wing. Under watchful eyes and the household staff abuzz with relief, Miss Marple took a moment to step into the rose garden. The afternoon sun had softened into a gentle glow, and the once somber beds now glimmered with dew and promise. Lady Amelia followed, her dress catching the light, and behind them walked Colonel Melchett, Mrs. Lancaster, and Miss Gwyn, each offering quiet expressions of gratitude. Jane, Lady Amelia said, her voice catching, I do not know how to thank you. You have restored not only our safety but our faith in one another. Miss Marple smiled kindly. You need only tend to your roses, Amelia. Let their renewal mark the day's true celebration. They paused near the central bed where the pearl of England rose Sir Rupert's chosen specimen stood, tall, its pale petals trembling in the breeze. Colonel Melchett knelt to inspect the soil. Remarkable, he observed. Not a trace of disturbance since we took the samples. The garden seems to have forgiven its visitor. Mrs. Lancaster drew in a breath. This place has always been a sanctuary. I feared the shadow of ill will would linger here. But shadows flee before the light, Miss Marple replied. Now that the culprit has confessed, we must see. To Lady Amelia's well-being and to the restoration of harmony in her home. They returned to Weatherbury Hall, where preparations had begun for an impromptu gathering, a small tea in the library, open to villagers who had accepted Lady Amelia's belated invitations. The room hummed with optimism as staff arranged fresh. Flowers and Emma laid out the safe, blue and gold china. Mr. Griffiths and Mrs. Hayes's successor, a shy new cook named Mrs. Haversham, coordinated the service. Even Mrs. Hayes, her shoulders slumped with shame, stood by at a distance, learning that grace could follow guilt. Inside the drawing-room, the guests reassembled. Sir Rupert Chalmers greeted them with quiet sincerity, having offered his support to Lady Amelia throughout the ordeal. Miss Marple watched as Miss Gwyn, pale but steady, took Madame McGillicuddy's arm to choose a seat. Colonel Melchett settled near a window, offering nods and reassurances to each visitor. Mrs. Lancaster moved among them with gentle warmth, determining to mend any tremors of distrust. Miss Marple turned to Lady Amelia. You should say a few words, Amelia, to set hearts at ease. Lady Amelia hesitated, her fingers brushing the silk of her gown. Then, gathering her composure, she rose. The room stilled at her presence. Friends, she began, her voice steady yet heartfelt, I cannot tell you how much your concern has meant to me these past days. I invited you here to celebrate summer's beauty, and instead we confronted a darkness that none of us expected. But thanks to Miss Marple, whose wisdom and kindness have guided us, I have seen that even in the face of betrayal, there is friendship, compassion, and resilience. Let us share tea, conversation, and laughter this afternoon, and promise that the garden spirit will bloom anew. A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Colonel Melchett raised his teacup in salute. Miss Gwyn dabbed at her eyes before offering Lady Amelia a gentle smile. Mrs. Lancaster, her face alight, extended her cup, as if toasting the new season of goodwill. Even Sir Rupert, standing by the hearth, allowed a faint glow to color his. Cheek-stocked Miss Marple returned to the central table, examining the arrangement of fresh elderflower cordial, jasmine tea, and delicate. Together they made their way back to the house, the marquee gently swaying in the evening breeze behind them. In the quiet that followed, the rose garden stood poised between day and night, its colors soft by dusk. And as lanterns were lit, along the paths and the hall doors closed, Miss Marple knew that once more the roses of Weatherbury Hall would carry the memory of this day, when tragedy yielded to hope, and when, amidst petals and laughter, justice and friendship were triumphantly reborn.